The autumn sun was setting over the bustling downtown streets as Officer James Miller sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. After 15 years on the force, he'd developed what he called a sixth sense about people, or at least that's what he told himself. The truth was, his instincts often led him down a path that had more to do with prejudice than actual police work. As the evening rush hour traffic crawled by, Miller's attention was drawn to a man walking confidently along the sidewalk. The man wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Miller's monthly salary, and he carried a sleek leather briefcase that gleamed under the streetlights. But it wasn't the expensive clothes or the briefcase that made Miller sit up straighter in his seat. It was the color of the man's skin. Miller watched as the businessman navigated through the crowd of commuters heading home. There was nothing suspicious about the man's behavior. He walked with purpose, occasionally checking his watch like any other professional rushing to a meeting. The briefcase swung gently at his side, its brass fixtures catching the light. Inside his patrol car, Miller felt that familiar itch, the one that had gotten him into trouble with his supervisors more than once. His captain had warned him about making stops without probable cause, especially after several complaints had been filed against him. But Miller always brushed off these warnings, convinced he was just doing his job. The businessman stopped at a crosswalk, waiting patiently for the light to change. Miller noticed how other pedestrians gave him space, perhaps unconsciously responding to his professional demeanor. A young woman even smiled at him as she stood nearby, and he returned the gesture politely. Miller's radio crackled with routine chatter. A fender bender on 5th Street, a shoplifting report from the mall across town. He should have been responding to actual calls, but something about this man and his briefcase had him fixated. He told himself it was the way the man held the briefcase close, how he adjusted his grip on it every few steps. But deep down, Miller knew these were normal behaviors he was twisting into suspicion. As the businessman turned down a quieter street, Miller made his decision. He pulled his patrol car away from the curb, ignoring the voice in his head that reminded him of department policies, constitutional rights, and everything he'd learned in his recent mandatory sensitivity training. The street was lined with law firms and financial offices, their windows still glowing as employees worked late into the evening. Security cameras dotted the building's facades, their lenses silently recording the scene below. Miller didn't notice them. His attention was solely focused on the businessman and that briefcase. The sound of Miller's car door opening echoed off the building walls. A few office workers glanced down from their windows, their faces illuminated by computer screens. The businessman continued walking, unaware of the officer's approach or the events about to unfold. Miller straightened his uniform and adjusted his badge, practicing the authoritative voice he perfected over years of traffic stops and arrests. His hand instinctively rested on his belt, close to his radio, as he quickened his pace to catch up with the businessman. The evening air had grown cooler, and steam rose from the vents in the sidewalk, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere. Traffic sounds from the main street were muffled here, replaced by the sharp clicks of the businessman's expensive shoes on concrete and Miller's heavier footfalls behind him. A janitor emptying trash bins outside one of the buildings paused his work to watch the scene unfold. He'd seen enough similar situations to sense trouble brewing, and he slowly reached for his phone in his pocket, just in case. The businessman was nearly at the corner when Miller called out, "Sir, police officer, I need you to stop right there." His voice carried more authority than the situation warranted, attracting the attention of several people leaving their offices for the day. Time seemed to slow as the businessman turned around. His expression revealed no fear, no anger, just a calm, questioning look that somehow made Miller even more determined to follow through with his plan. The briefcase was still held firmly in the businessman's right hand, its leather surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Miller closed the distance between them, his boots scuffing against the sidewalk. He could feel eyes on him from all directions now. Office workers, passers-by, the janitor with his phone partially raised. But he was too focused on his target to notice these potential witnesses. The businessman's calm demeanor didn't waver as Miller approached. He stood perfectly still, his free hand visible at his side, demonstrating an understanding of police interactions that spoke of previous experience. The only movement was his eyes, which darted briefly to Miller's name badge before returning to his face. A gentle breeze stirred papers in a nearby trash bin, carrying with it the sounds of city life, car horns, distant sirens, the rumble of the subway below. These familiar urban noises seemed to fade into the background as Miller prepared to take actions that would soon change not only his career, but the entire department. The businessman's briefcase gleamed innocently in the fading light, holding secrets that would soon come to light. Neither man knew it yet, but this moment, this decision by Officer Miller to act on his prejudices rather than his training, would become a turning point in both their lives. Standing there on that quiet street, surrounded by the growing crowd of curious onlookers, Officer Miller was about to learn a harsh lesson about assumptions, power, and consequences. His next actions would not only end his career, but would spark a chain of events that would force an entire police department to confront its deepest flaws. As Miller opened his mouth to speak again, security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every moment of what was about to become a viral story of justice, prejudice, and long overdue change in law enforcement. The businessman's hand tightened slightly on the briefcase handle, ready for whatever was about to unfold. "I'm going to need to see what's in that briefcase," Miller announced, his voice carrying down the quiet street. The businessman's expression remained composed, though a slight furrow appeared between his brows. "Officer, may I ask why you've stopped me?" The businessman asked calmly, his voice steady and professional. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm on my way to an important meeting." Several onlookers had slowed their pace, some pulling out their phones discreetly. Miller shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the growing audience but unwilling to back down. "Just a routine check, sir. Your briefcase matches a description we received earlier. It was a lie, and they both knew it." No such description had been called in, and Miller's body language betrayed his fabrication. "Officer Miller," the businessman said, glancing at the name badge again, "I understand you're doing your job, but I must decline. Without probable cause or a warrant, you have no legal right to search my property. I'm sure you're aware of the Fourth Amendment." The mention of his name and constitutional rights made Miller's face flush. He'd dealt with people who knew their rights before, but something about this man's quiet confidence pushed his buttons. The small crowd of observers had grown, their presence adding tension to the already charged atmosphere. "Listen," Miller said, taking a step closer, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." His hand rested meaningfully on his belt, though not near his weapon. Even Miller knew better than that, with so many witnesses around. The businessman took a slow, deliberate breath. "Officer, I want to be very clear. I do not consent to any search of my person or property. If you believe you have probable cause, please state it for the record." He gestured slightly to the phones recording the interaction. A young office worker who had stopped to watch spoke up from the sideline. "Hey, I'm recording this, officer, just so you know." Others nodded, their phones held steady, documenting every moment of the escalating situation. Miller felt sweat forming under his collar. He knew he should walk away. Every training session, every department memo, every warning from his superiors told him to back off. But something in him couldn't let it go. He'd convinced himself there had to be something in that briefcase, something that would justify his actions. "Sir, put the briefcase on the ground and step back," Miller ordered, his voice taking on an edge that made several onlookers exchange worried glances. The businessman didn't move, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "I will not," he replied firmly. "What you're doing is illegal, Officer Miller, and you know it. I suggest you think very carefully about your next action." Miller's patience snapped. In 2 quick steps, he closed the distance between them and grabbed the briefcase handle. The businessman didn't resist. He simply let go, a decision that would prove far more damaging to Miller than any resistance could have been. The crowd gasped collectively. Someone muttered, "This isn't right." Another voice called out, "Badge number. Get his badge number." The phones kept recording as Miller placed the briefcase on a nearby bench. "Last chance," the businessman said quietly. "Officer Miller, what you're about to do is a clear violation of my constitutional rights. There will be consequences." But Miller wasn't listening anymore. His fingers worked at the briefcase's locks, fumbling slightly in his haste. The businessman stood perfectly still, watching with an expression that had shifted from concern to something closer to pity. A police siren wailed in the distance, and for a moment Miller hesitated. He could still stop, still walk away from this situation. but his pride and prejudice had carried him too far to turn back now. The locks clicked open. The businessman pulled out his own phone and began recording. "For the record," he announced clearly, "Officer Miller is now illegally searching my private property without probable cause, without a warrant, and against my explicitly stated lack of consent." The crowd had grown larger, with people spilling off the sidewalk onto the street. Office workers pressed against windows above, watching the scene unfold. The janitor who had first noticed the confrontation was now live-streaming everything to social media. Miller's hands shook slightly as he opened the briefcase. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene, dramatic shafts of light illuminating the moment that would end his career. As the lid lifted, he was already imagining what he might find: drugs, weapons, stolen goods, anything to justify his actions. What he saw instead made his stomach drop. The businessman's voice cut through the tense silence. "Officer Miller, I believe you'll find everything in order. Those are legal documents prepared for filing tomorrow morning. I suggest you examine them carefully, particularly the one on top." Miller's face drained of color as he read the heading on the first document. The crowd pressed closer, trying to see what had caused such a dramatic reaction, but the businessman continued speaking, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed street. "Those papers represent months of research into patterns of illegal searches and racial profiling in this precinct. Congratulations, Officer Miller. You've just provided a perfect example for our case." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the city itself seemed to hold its breath as the implications of what had just happened sank in. Miller stared at the papers, then at the businessman, then at the dozens of phones recording his every move. In the distance, another siren wailed. Closer this time. Someone in the crowd had called for a supervisor, and the responding units were on their way. Miller's career wasn't just ending. It was about to become a cautionary tale for police departments across the country. As the first backup unit turned onto the street, lights flashing, the businessman calmly reached for his briefcase. "I believe we're done here, Officer Miller. Don't worry, you'll be hearing from my office very soon." The first backup patrol car pulled up to the curb, its lights painting the growing crowd in flashes of red and blue. A senior officer stepped out, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The group of civilians with raised phones, his colleagues standing frozen beside an open briefcase, and the calm businessman who seemed to be the center of it all. "What's the situation here?" the senior officer asked, approaching the group. Before Miller could respond, several voices from the crowd began speaking at once, each eager to share what they'd witnessed. "He stopped this man for no reason. Check our videos, we got it all. He forced open the briefcase." The businessman raised his hand slightly, and somehow this quiet gesture silenced the crowd more effectively than any police command could have. "Lieutenant," he said, reading the superior officer's rank, "I'm a civil rights attorney. Your officer here just conducted an illegal search of my briefcase without probable cause or consent. Everything has been recorded, both by myself and these concerned citizens." The lieutenant's expression tightened as he turned to Miller. "Is this true, Officer Miller?" But Miller stood speechless, still staring at the documents that had sealed his fate. The top paper clearly outlined a class-action lawsuit against the department, complete with statistics, dates, and a pattern of behavior that Miller had just dramatically reinforced. The businessman began carefully returning his papers to the briefcase. "The documents your officer was so eager to examine are part of an ongoing investigation into systematic racial profiling within this precinct. We were planning to file tomorrow morning, but given tonight's events, I believe we'll need to update some of our findings." More patrol cars arrived, their lights creating an impromptu light show on the office building's glass facades. The crowd continued recording as additional officers created a perimeter, trying to restore some order to the scene. But their presence couldn't undo what had already happened. A quick-thinking rookie officer noticed some of the onlookers trying to leave and politely asked them to stay. "We'll need statements from everyone who witnessed this," she announced, pulling out her notebook. The businessman nodded approvingly at her professional demeanor, such a stark contrast to Miller's actions. The lieutenant, now fully grasping the severity of the situation, clicked his radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need internal affairs at this location." He turned to Miller, his voice low but firm. "Officer Miller, surrender your badge and weapon. "You're on administrative leave pending investigation." Miller's hands moved mechanically as he complied, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. 15 years on the force, ended by one briefcase and his own prejudices. The businessman watched the process with no sign of satisfaction or triumph, only a tired resignation that suggested he'd seen this scenario play out too many times before. The crowd's videos were already spreading across social media. Phones buzzed with notifications as the clips went viral, each new share adding to the digital wildfire that would soon engulf the department. Comments and reactions poured in by the second. Another abuse of power. Finally caught on camera. This needs to stop. Internal Affairs arrived within 20 minutes, their unmarked cars pulling up quietly compared to the patrol unit's dramatic entrance. The investigators moved with practiced efficiency, separating witnesses for statements, collecting badge numbers, and documenting everything about the scene. The businessman handed his card to the lead investigator. "My office will be in touch first thing tomorrow. We'll need copies of all body camera footage, including from the responding officers." The investigator nodded, knowing this case would quickly become a priority. As the formal investigation began, the true scope of what Miller had stumbled into became clear. The briefcase contained not just a simple lawsuit, but a comprehensive investigation that had been building for months. Statistics on stop and frisk incidents, racial disparities in traffic stops, witness statements, and internal department communications all painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Miller sat in a patrol car, waiting to be transported back to the station. Through the window, he watched the businessman talking with investigators, gesturing occasionally to emphasize a point. The attorney's calm professionalism never wavered, even as he described how this incident would now become a centerpiece of the case against the department. The city's police commissioner was already being notified. Press vehicles began arriving, their news crews setting up under the streetlights. This wasn't going to be a story that could be buried or explained away. Too many people had witnessed it, too many cameras had recorded it, and too much evidence was now in the hands of a legal team that had been waiting for exactly this kind of incident. As the scene continued to unfold, the businessman checked his watch and made a phone call. "Cancel my dinner plans," he said quietly. "Something came up that needs immediate attention." "No, nothing's wrong. In fact, this might be exactly what we needed to drive change in the department." The lieutenant, finishing up his preliminary report, couldn't help but overhear these words. He looked at Miller, then at the briefcase, and finally at the crowd of witnesses still providing statements. In all his years of service, he'd never seen a routine patrol go so wrong, or perhaps, from the perspective of justice, so right. By midnight, the video of the briefcase incident had exploded across social media platforms. The original clips, posted by various witnesses, had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. News stations were interrupting their regular programming to show the footage, with analysts and experts weighing in on the legal implications. Inside the police department's conference room, emergency meetings were in full swing. The police commissioner sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened and coffee cup empty, as he listened to a parade of advisors outline just how bad the situation was becoming. The main video has over 1 million views already, one media relations officer reported, scrolling through her tablet. And these aren't just local views. This is national. We're trending on every major platform. The department's legal counsel cleared his throat. It gets worse. The attorney involved has one of the highest success rates in civil rights cases on the East Coast. His firm has been building this case against us for months, and now Officer Miller has handed them exactly what they needed. Out in the city, the story was spreading like wildfire through neighborhoods that had long complained about similar treatment. People gathered in coffee shops and diners, watching the footage on their phones, sharing their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. The businessman's law firm was working through the night. Junior associates ordered late-night takeout as they revised the lawsuit to include the evening's events. The conference room walls were covered with photos, timelines, and statistics, months of careful documentation that now had a powerful new addition. "Look at how clean this evidence is," one associate said, replaying the video. "Multiple angles, clear audio, perfect documentation of rights being stated and ignored. This is exactly what we've been trying to prove has been happening regularly." Back at the precinct, internal affairs investigators were going through Miller's record with a fine-tooth comb. His personnel file told a story that should have raised red flags years ago: multiple complaints about unauthorized searches, a pattern of targeting minorities, warnings from supervisors that had gone unheeded. The night shift dispatcher fielded call after call from reporters seeking comment. She stuck to the official statement. The department is aware of the incident and is conducting a thorough investigation. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously. Social media continued to churn. Hashtags related to the incident trended worldwide. People who had never shared a political post in their lives were sharing this video, adding their own comments. Watch how calm the attorney stays. He knew exactly what was happening. This is what we've been talking about all along. One briefcase just changed everything. Local community leaders began organizing a response. In church basements and community centers, people gathered to discuss what this moment could mean for their ongoing efforts at police reform. The video played on loop on phones and laptops as they planned their next steps. This isn't just another incident, one community organizer told her group. This is proof. This is what we've been trying to document for years, captured perfectly on dozens of cameras. The businessman's phone hadn't stopped ringing since he'd left the scene. National news networks wanted interviews. Civil rights organizations offered support and resources. Other law firms reached out to share similar cases they'd been working on. In his home office, he reviewed the footage one more time. Each angle showed the same story. A clear abuse of power, perfectly documented. He'd spent years building cases like this, but rarely had he seen one so clear-cut, so undeniable. Miller sat alone in his apartment, watching his career and reputation unravel in real time on social media. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow officers, some supportive, others disappointed, many just stunned by how quickly everything had fallen apart. The police union representatives were already preparing their response, though even they knew this would be a difficult case to defend. The evidence was too clear, the violation too obvious, the witnesses too numerous. Dawn was breaking over the city when the first morning news shows began their coverage. Satellite trucks lined the street outside police headquarters. Reporters did live stand-ups, gesturing to the building behind them as they recounted the previous evening's events. Inside the department, officers arriving for the morning shift walked past internal affairs investigators still at work. The mood was tense, subdued. Everyone knew this wasn't just about one officer or one briefcase. This was about long-standing issues that could no longer be ignored. The businessman's morning schedule was packed with meetings. His legal team, community leaders, police reform advocates. The lawsuit that had been months in preparation was now at the center of a national conversation about law enforcement and civil rights. The internal affairs investigation moved with unprecedented speed. In a conference room deep within police headquarters, investigators pored over Officer Miller's history with the department. What they found painted a troubling picture that went far beyond the briefcase incident. "Look at this pattern," one investigator said, spreading files across the table. Traffic stops, pedestrian searches, random checks. The racial disparity is impossible to ignore. The numbers told a story that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or circumstance. Another investigator pulled up Miller's body camera footage from the past 6 months. Hours of video showed a clear pattern. Minorities were stopped more frequently, searched more aggressively, and treated with less respect than other citizens. The briefcase incident wasn't an isolated event, it was just the first one to go viral. Down the hall, the police commissioner faced a room full of reporters. Camera lights blazed as he made his statement. "We are conducting a thorough investigation into not just this incident, but our entire approach to community policing. The trust between law enforcement and the public must be earned every day, and we acknowledge that we have work to do." The businessman's law firm had transformed into a hub of activity. The main conference room looked like a war room, with timelines covering the walls and teams of lawyers analyzing similar cases from across the city. The briefcase incident had opened a floodgate. People were coming forward with their own stories, their own videos, their own experiences. "We've received over 200 calls since yesterday," one paralegal reported, updating the case files. Each one describes a similar pattern of behavior. Some of these incidents go back years. The city council called an emergency session to address the growing crisis. As members filed into the chamber, protesters gathered outside with signs and chants. The crowd was diverse: students, professionals, families, all united in demanding change. Inside the council chamber, the businessman presented his findings. His voice remained calm and professional as he outlined years of systematic issues within the police department. The briefcase incident wasn't just about one officer's poor judgment, it was a symptom of deeper problems. "What happened to me was not unique," he explained to the council members. "What makes it different is that it was caught on camera from multiple angles and that I have the resources and knowledge to fight back. How many others have faced similar treatment without these advantages?" Back at Internal Affairs, investigators discovered something even more troubling. Multiple officers had filed reports expressing concern about Miller's behavior over the years. These reports had seemingly disappeared into administrative black holes, never resulting in serious action. "Look at these dates," one investigator said, pointing to a timeline. "Complaints filed, concerns raised, suggestions for additional training, all ignored or minimized. This goes beyond one officer. This is a systematic failure." The investigation expanded. Other officers' records were pulled for review. The department's training procedures, supervision protocols, and complaint handling systems all came under scrutiny. What started with one briefcase was revealing cracks in the entire foundation. Community meetings sprang up across the city. In church basements, community centers, and school auditoriums, people gathered to share their stories and discuss solutions. The businessman attended many of these meetings, listening more than speaking, building a more complete picture of the community's experiences. "This isn't about punishing individual officers," he explained at one meeting. "This is about fixing a broken system. We need accountability, but we also need change. Real, lasting change in how law enforcement interacts with our communities." The police union found itself in a difficult position. While they were obligated to represent Miller, they couldn't ignore the evidence. Some union officials began quietly pushing for broader reforms, recognizing that the department's credibility was at stake. National civil rights organizations sent representatives to the city. What had started as a local incident was becoming a case study in police reform. Experts in law enforcement, civil rights attorneys, and community advocates all saw an opportunity for meaningful change. Miller himself remained secluded, watching as his actions sparked a movement he never intended. His attorney advised him to stay quiet, but the weight of what he'd done, not just to himself, but to his department and his profession, pressed heavily on his conscience. The businessman's original lawsuit expanded to include not just individual incidents, but system-wide issues: training deficiencies, supervision failures, lack of accountability measures. Each new piece of evidence strengthened the case for comprehensive reform. As the investigation continued, something unexpected began to happen. Some officers, particularly younger ones, started coming forward with their own concerns about departmental culture and practices. They saw this moment as an opportunity to help reshape their profession. "We didn't join the force to perpetuate injustice," one young officer told investigators. "We want to be part of the solution, but the system has to change." 3 weeks after the briefcase incident, the police commissioner stood before the press again, this time to announce Officer Miller's termination. The conference room was packed with reporters, their cameras tracking every expression on the commissioner's face as he delivered the news. "After a thorough investigation, we have determined that Officer Miller's actions violated multiple department policies, constitutional rights, and the trust of our community," the commissioner stated. "Effective immediately, he has been terminated from his position with our department." But the announcement didn't stop there. The commissioner pulled out a thick document, a comprehensive reform plan that had been developed in consultation with community leaders, civil rights experts, and law enforcement specialists. "This incident has forced us to look deeply at our department's practices," he continued. "The changes we're announcing today go far beyond one officer's actions. We're implementing mandatory body cameras for all officers, establishing a civilian oversight board, and completely revamping our training programs." The businessman sat in the audience, his now famous briefcase beside him. He listened carefully, taking notes as the commissioner outlined the changes. His law firm had been instrumental in shaping many of these reforms, using the evidence they'd gathered to push for specific improvements. Outside the police headquarters, a crowd had gathered to hear the announcement. When word of Miller's termination spread, there wasn't celebration. Instead, there was a quiet determination. People understood that while one officer's firing was significant, the real victory lay in the broader changes being implemented. Miller watched the announcement from his living room, surrounded by packed boxes. His career in law enforcement was over, but the impact of his actions would continue to reshape the department he'd left behind. His final written statement, submitted through his attorney, showed that perhaps he had finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. "I let my prejudices override my training and my duty," the statement read. "My actions not only violated someone's rights, they betrayed the trust that communities place in law enforcement. I hope my story serves as a warning to other officers about the consequences of allowing bias to influence their actions." Back at the police academy, instructors were already incorporating the Briefcase incident into their training materials. Recruits watched the videos and analyzed what went wrong, learning how unconscious bias can cloud judgment and lead to constitutional violations. "This isn't just about following procedures," one instructor explained to his class. "This is about understanding why these protections exist in the first place and recognizing how quickly poor decisions can escalate into career-ending mistakes." The businessman's law firm continued their work, using the momentum from this case to push for similar reforms in other cities. The Briefcase incident had become a catalyst for change across the country, with police departments proactively examining their own practices to prevent similar situations. Community meetings took on a different tone. Instead of just voicing complaints, residents were now actively involved in shaping department policies. Officers attended these meetings not just to listen, but to engage in genuine dialogue about improving police-community relations. "We're seeing real change," one community leader observed during a meeting. "Not just on paper, but in how officers interact with our neighborhoods. There's more respect, more understanding on both sides." The department's new Civilian Oversight Board began its work, reviewing complaints and monitoring officer conduct. Its members included former law enforcement officials, civil rights attorneys, and community representatives, a diverse group committed to ensuring fair and unbiased policing. Training programs were completely overhauled. New modules focused on constitutional rights, implicit bias recognition, and de-escalation techniques. Officers weren't just taught what to do, they were taught to understand why these principles mattered. The businessman continued his work, but now with a different focus. Instead of just documenting problems, he began helping departments implement solutions. His Briefcase, which had once contained evidence of systemic issues, now carried proposals for positive change. As the reforms took hold, something unexpected happened. Morale within the department actually improved. Officers reported feeling more confident in their interactions with the public, knowing they had clear guidelines and better training to support their decisions. "We're not just enforcing the law anymore," one veteran officer explained. "We're building trust, one interaction at a time. That makes our jobs easier and our communities safer." 1 year after the Briefcase incident, the city's police department had transformed in ways few could have predicted. The changes weren't just on paper, they were visible in daily interactions between officers and citizens, in improved community relations, and in the statistics that tracked police encounters. At a community center downtown, the businessman stood before a mixed audience of police officers and local residents. The Briefcase that had sparked so much change sat on the podium beside him as he shared the latest progress report. "A year ago, we were adversaries," he began, gesturing to both citizens and officers. "Today, we're partners in building a better system. The numbers tell the story. Complaints down by 60%, successful arrests up, and most importantly, community trust at its highest level in department history." The department's training academy had become a model for other cities. Police departments from across the country sent representatives to observe the new programs in action. Body camera footage from positive encounters was used to teach best practices, while footage from the Briefcase incident served as a powerful reminder of what was at stake. "We now start each training session with a simple question," the academy director explained to a group of visiting officials. "We ask our recruits, what's in the Briefcase?" It's become a way to teach them that every citizen they encounter has a story, has rights, and deserves respect. The Civilian Oversight Board had proven especially effective. Their quarterly reports showed consistent improvement in police-community interactions. More importantly, when issues did arise, they were addressed quickly and transparently. In his new role as a consultant on police reform, the businessman traveled to other cities, helping them implement similar changes. His briefcase now carried success stories instead of complaints, examples of positive change rather than evidence of misconduct. The incident that brought us here was a crisis, he told one department, but it was also an opportunity. The question isn't whether problems exist, it's how we choose to address them. Former Officer Miller had also found an unexpected role in reform efforts. After much reflection, he began speaking to police academies about his experience, helping new officers understand how unconscious bias can cloud judgment and lead to career-ending mistakes. "I thought I was doing my job," he would tell them, "but I was really just confirming my own prejudices. Don't make the same mistakes I did." The briefcase could have contained anything. What it actually held was a mirror to our entire system. The department's new policies had created unexpected benefits. Officers reported feeling more confident in their work, knowing they had clear guidelines and support for making the right decisions. Community members felt more comfortable approaching officers, leading to better cooperation and more effective law enforcement. Local businesses noticed the change too. The same street where the briefcase incident occurred had become a symbol of improved police-community relations. Officers on patrol regularly stopped to chat with store owners and residents, building the kind of relationships that prevent problems before they start. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes," one officer explained during a community meeting. "It's about building trust. When people trust us, they help us. When they help us, we all benefit." The businessman's law firm had shifted its focus too. While they still handled civil rights cases, they now spent more time working with departments on proactive reforms. The briefcase that once held evidence against the police now carried proposals for partnership and progress. At the one-year mark, the city held a public forum to discuss the changes. The audience included officers, community members, city officials, and representatives from other departments interested in following their example. A year ago, a briefcase showed us everything that was wrong with our system, the police commissioner told the gathering. Today, it reminds us of how far we've come and how far we can still go. Every interaction between an officer and a citizen is an opportunity to build trust or break it. We choose to build it. The businessman closed the forum with a simple demonstration. He opened his briefcase, now empty, and placed it on the podium. "This briefcase once contained evidence of what needed to change," he said. "Today, it represents the space we all must fill, with understanding, with respect, with the kind of policing that serves and protects everyone equally." The question isn't just what's in the briefcase anymore. The question is, what will we do with the opportunity it gave us? As the audience applauded, officers and citizens alike understood that while the briefcase incident had ended one officer's career, it had begun something much more important. A real change in how law enforcement and communities work together for the benefit of all. The end.